he gets intelligence that Lee is nearby, and he has the opportunity to catch him completely off guard. And even with this intelligence, he refuses to deploy his troops. And so Lincoln famously sent him a letter where he says, if you're not using your army, would you mind if I borrowed it? Southern Gothic is an interesting psychological thing that springs out of this utter devastation that the South experiences.
Yeah, it's one of the unfortunate realities of the world we live in, that war brings such innovation and such kind of, creativity.
Technology. The lands awkwardly breaks his foot as he lands on stage, and he cries out, "Sic semper tyrannis." So, thus is it always to tyrants. They ostensibly get their 40 acres and a mule. Something that Kendrick Lamar puts in several of his songs, I've noticed. Life is by no means improved. It's a tough existence. Afterwards, he says the war started in my front yard and it ended in my front parlour. But you mentioned the timeline, so I'll lay out briefly the actual timeline of the war. Mm-hmm. The first shot of the war is fired on April 12th, 1861, and that is what's called the bombardment of Fort Sumter. So in South Carolina, which is the first state to secede, they secede on December 20th, 1860, so a few months before. And the rest of the Deep South states follow thereafter, and then the Upper South states after that. So I think you end up with, if I'm not mistaken, 13, is it 11? It's either 11 or 13 southern states. Mm-hmm. By the time that they're all in, I think Texas might be. Is Texas the very? No. Texas is one of the sort of middle ones amongst those. I think North Carolina is one of the very last. Yeah. Again, because we were talking about the ambivalence there. And Virginia itself, interestingly, West Virginia, that is now a state, was not a state at the beginning of the war. West Virginia was seceded from Virginia, so a sort of double secession. They'd seceded as part of Virginia away from the Union, but then those in the western part of Virginia thought, no, hang on a minute, we want to be in the north, so they seceded from.
How many Virginia, more points on the compass are there for me to make a new state?
Yeah, exactly. So they seceded from Virginia to reattach themselves to the north, and that happens during the war. That happens bang in the middle of the war. So quite interesting. But anyway, where was I? So Fort Sumter. So basically, when South Carolina secedes, the Union forces that are stationed there, they think, oh shit, we better go. But they don't want to let go of the naval bases that they have entirely. So they all recede to Fort Sumter, which is in Charleston, the sort of harbour of Charleston, which is the capital of South Carolina. And so immediately the South Carolinians start setting up cannons to fire at them. And the very first shot was fired by a guy called Edmund Ruffin, who was, I think, a 70 or 80-year-old fire eater, one of these very passionate pro-slavery men. And he was really chuffed with himself ever after that he was, for the remainder of what probably wasn't awfully long in his life, he was very, very chuffed that he'd fired the first shot, which was ordered by a guy called... Yeah, basically. But there's all these interesting kind of incestuous things, like the guy that orders that, who is General PGT Beauregard, Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard's great name, very fiery southerner. He orders the first shot to be fired, and he's actually firing on the guy who had taught him at West Point, which is the military college. So Robert Anderson, General Robert Anderson, on the northern side, he's obviously there in Fort Sumter. He's being fired on. I don't think he knows it at the time, but he's being fired on by his former student at West Point and later assistant, because he was such a genius, Beauregard, that he was kept on for an extra year as a sort of teaching assistant by Anderson. And so there's all these sorts of things, all the great generals of the Civil War were at West Point, either together or they slightly missed each other. A lot of them fought side by side in the Mexican War. Many of them had helped to suppress John Brown. So to go back to just a good moment to go back to him briefly, in 1859, John Brown performs a raid on Harper's Ferry, which is a sort of federal arsenal of weapons. He goes with a band of of ex-slaves, other abolitionists, grabs weapons, and his idea is he wants to engender an uprising by slaves in Virginia. But it all goes horribly wrong. The first guy to die is ironically a black he's sort of standing guard at the armory or something. So slightly it goes off a bit wrong. And many of the soldiers who come to arrest him, Lee is one of them. I believe Jackson is another. Are then going to be crucial figures a couple of years later in either on the same side or on other sides of the coin in the Civil War itself. So there's all these kind of interesting crossovers, moments where people are meeting in the lead up. And I think the best coincidence of all time. So the war is 1861 to 1865. Just around, because I sort of started to say that before and then I got sidetracked by Sumter. But 1861 to 1865. There's a man called Wilmer McLean who has a farm in Virginia in a place called Manassas. And the very first battle following the firing on Fort Sumter, is at this place called Manassas. And he actually has a Union shell lands in his kitchen, I think, or his front room. So the war starts in his yard, essentially, because it's his property's right on the battlefield. And he's obviously terrified. And so after a while, because a lot of fighting's happening in Virginia, after a while, he says, screw this, I'm moving to somewhere quieter. So he moves to a place called Appomattox Courthouse, formerly a courthouse. And the final surrender, where Grant accepts the surrender by Lee in a very moving scene, takes place, funnily enough, in Appomattox Courthouse in Wilmer McLean's, who Wilmer McLean owns this house. So he says afterwards, the war started in my front yard and it ended in my front parlour. So he'd done his utmost to get away from the war, and it had ended up at his doorstep again. But thankfully for him, in a more peaceful sense the second time.
Yeah, because I also think it's crazy to me. I always kind of assumed that it happened a lot earlier in like the 1800s than it did, or maybe even like late 1700s or something. But when you think about it in the scheme of things, it's about 50 years until World War One, and you think how different the world is then. America had a civil war half a century before.
It's extraordinary, and there were still veterans meeting up there was a 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, which was in 1863. There was a 75th anniversary in 1938, at which there were surviving veterans present.
Yeah. So
this is a modern war, and it's the first war in which photographs are being regularly taken. So there's this extraordinary documentary that I mentioned. The American Civil War by Ken Burns, and he invents a thing that editors the world over will know, called the Ken Burns effect, which is where you take a still image, and on Final Cut Pro you can literally press a button and it will give you the Ken Burns effect. You take a still image and you put a camera over it, and you move the camera across the still image to create the feeling of movement, and in concert with an extraordinary amount of sort of sound design, music, all the rest of it, you get this incredibly vivid sense that you're really there and it's really happening, even though you're just looking at a still image. So it's an extraordinary effect. But photography has just come in, so it's one of the most photographed. Well, at the time, it's obviously the only photograph war, but I think it's one of the most photographed wars, even now, because people were so excited by the invention of the camera that they were just photographing everything.
People got a new gadget and they really wanted to test it out. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. So, extraordinary. So, and it's the first war, I think, in which machine guns are used. It's the first war in which ironclad naval vessels are used. So basically, even little things like pockets that we have in our trousers now. That was the first time that was done was in the American Civil War. The northern troops were given pockets in which to hold their various kind of personal items. To make life easier, so they weren't sort of carrying a million things. So there's so many things that come down to us, modern inventions that were from the Civil War. So it is an incredibly modern war in that sense.
Yeah, it's one of the unfortunate realities of the world we live in, that war brings such innovation and such kind of,
Yeah,
creativity
technology. Yeah.
in terms of technology, in terms of like
Sad that
medicine,
it
all
has
those
to
other
be.
kinds of
Yeah,
things. Why does it have to be at
yeah.
the cost of like so many millions of people dying? Like it's a bit crazy.
Yeah, quite. Yeah. It's a sad
Um,
reality, but it's true.
yeah,
It's well, necessity is the mother of invention.
yeah.
When you need a thing is when that thing gets done. You're not gonna do something unless you've got a pressing need to do it. You're not going to
Yeah.
commit enormous amounts of economic capital to something if there's not a pressing reason to do so. And when there is, that's when you get invention.
I also see the same kind of sentiment towards like space travel and stuff as well. Like people criticizing, oh well, why aren't we doing more to like do stuff for our current planet, rather than trying to leave it and spend all this money on trying to go somewhere else. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
think of, we wouldn't have things like the X-ray if we didn't have space travel. Like some of the research that's done in space, whether it's studying other planets, whether it's kind of figuring out, how to survive in hostile environments, or developing machinery to see deeper into space and things like that. These are all things that we can use.
It all essentially came from a kind of somewhat childish space race between the Americans and the Russians in the Cold War.
Well, yeah, for culture.
It's
an interesting. Again, it's a whole kettle of fish topic that we can definitely have a whole episode on, I think. But it's also fascinating that the Soviets actually had the upper hand on the Americans in terms of the space race up until the moon landing. So they beat them to everything else pretty much. As we know from history, people only care when you get to the big finish line at the end.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone forgets the early stuff.
Yeah, back 100 years back in the past. We'll go back on topic, but I mean, so we've got the timelines. We've established the sides and the geography of everything. So obviously they're fighting at this point, and what I think is what I'd be interested to know more is kind of what led to the Union victory. Like, obviously, in terms of manufacturing and industrial base, the North had a massive advantage in that way, because they had the more capability to kind of supply their army and to logistically probably be better off. But how does the rest of the war, how does like the war kind of play out in that sense in terms of the balance of power being tipped?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, I mean, I can race through to 1863 because after First Manassas, as it's called, or First Bull Run, because the North, I believe, calls things after the place it takes place in. The South calls it after the nearest river. So every battle, it's confusing. Every battle kind of has two names, but Manassas is kind of the standard, but some people call it Bull Run. After that, there's a kind of essentially a sort of phony war for sort of 6 months where everything goes a bit quiet and a new because the first battle of Manassas is a Confederate victory. A surprise Confederate victory. People were so naive about this. They thought, oh, this will be a jolly. It'll all be over quickly. We'll whip those rebels and it'll all be over shortly. So you actually had people, because it's near Washington DC. So you actually had politicians coming out with their wives in carts, in horse-drawn carts, to just witness the battle, like they were going to a sort of day at the races.
Like go to the panto.
So they just thought, oh, this will be fun. We'll watch they'll fire on each other. The Confederacy will realise they were wrong and they'll skulk off, and we'll all have a nice day out. Of course, that's not what happened. And what happened, in fact, was it started well for the Union, but the Confederate forces, and this is another first. We're talking about firsts. The first time forces had been sent to a battlefield by train is actually the Confederacy uses their quite limited railways. Again, North is more industrial, so they have more railways. But the South has a few, and they use them quite well. And they're bringing in backup constantly throughout the battle. So they're just throwing more and more divisions at the North. So initially it's it's looking good. It's looking good for the North. They're kind of scattering the various divisions, and the South are a bit chaotic and they don't quite know what they're doing. But then you have a man called Thomas Jackson, who is an eccentric guy. He's very religious, and he has kind of peculiar sort of physical things. Like he has one arm slightly longer than the other, so he holds his longer one up in the air when he's on horseback, because he thinks it balances so the blood can run down and circulate in his body correctly, because he's worried that his longer arm is taking too much blood. So he's a peculiar guy. He sucks on lemons constantly. Strange man, but an amazing general, and totally fearless. A little bit like U.S. Grant in the Northern General, totally impervious to danger, and an incredible morale booster for his men, because he'll just walk straight into gunfire. He's just going for it. So anyway, he gets this famous nickname Stonewall Jackson, which you'll have heard, because when it's all chaotic, his is the only line that holds. He is so, his men believe in him so thoroughly that they stick with him when everybody else is fleeing. And another regiment looks over, and their commander says, in a desperate attempt to get his men to rally, he says, "Look, there is Jackson standing like a stone wall." So he gets this nickname, Stonewall Jackson. Anyway, so building on that, it begins to turn in favour of the South. And not only does the Union retreat, it turns into a full-on rout when the retreating guns get caught up with the fleeing civilians who have come to witness it. So it's total pell-mell chaos. Everybody's falling over everybody, and these poor sort of politicians and their wives, who thought they were just going to have a kind of fun day at the races, albeit naively and stupidly, are now in the midst of it, and they're fleeing for their lives, and actually they're actually an impediment to the retreating army because they're getting in the way. So anyway, following this, it's decided, I believe McDowell at this point is the sort of head, is the general in charge of the overall Union army. Of course, it's a collection of smaller armies. The Army of the Potomac being the primary one that fights at Manassas. Anyway, so a guy called George McLellan, a very arrogant guy who thinks he's sort of God's gift to the world, is put in charge of the Army of the Potomac. And from sort of summer 61 through to the beginning of 62, he's like the Grand Old Duke of York. He marches them up the hill and he marches them down again, and he gets them into really good shape so that they're performing amazing drill maneuvers and they know everything. But he is absolutely terrified of actually using them. So he won't ever attack the Southern forces, even when they're really, really close. There's a moment, I think it's in 62, where he gets intelligence that Lee is nearby, and he has the opportunity to catch him completely off guard, which would have been a massive victory. And even with this intelligence, he refuses to deploy his troops. And so Lincoln famously sent him a letter where he says, if you're not using your army, would you mind if I borrowed it? Anyway, so there's this kind of phony war for sort of 6 months because McLellan just doesn't want to do anything with the army. He's just kind of, he's just drilling them like crazy. And he's sort of pompous and vain, and he likes the sort of grand ceremonial of the whole thing, but doesn't actually want to use them. So then you have various battles in 62 where it kind of goes either way, but then the crucial turning point, to finally come to your question, is right at the beginning of July 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg, which is where it starts to really go wrong for the Confederacy. So Lee is quite stubborn, ignores certain of his commanders who were giving him good advice, and he sticks to sort of tactics that he's used in the past, but the problem is it's the wrong kind of battlefield. The men that he's trying to march up the hill is just way too long, and it's sort of like the Somme, they just get mown down in what's called Pickett's Charge. And Pickett himself, General Pickett, George Pickett, he is forever after bitter, very, very bitter about losing his entire... because I think Lee at one point says to him, "Okay, take the remainder of your division," and he says, "What division?" They've just been completely wiped out.
It's a very it's very much kind of like Romans in Teutoburg Forest with Varus and his legions.
Where are my legions? Yeah, it is.
Give me back my legions.
Yeah, he wants his division back, but it's gone. Anyway, so it starts to go wrong, and that basically cuts the South off from Lee. So Lee had been heading north again, and quite successfully, but they managed to cut him off, and there's no more from that point on. There's really no more ground that Lee can take going north. From that point on, they're sort of retreating slowly retreating, fighting battles into the south. So then you have the siege of Vicksburg. The siege of Vicksburg is a larger thing. Gettysburg is kind of somewhere in the middle, amidst all of this, but in a slightly different theatre, in the Mississippi theatre, which is obviously more westerly. Grant has been pressing away at the Southern forces and very successfully captures the town of Vicksburg, which is essential because it allows him to control the Mississippi River. Which cuts the Confederacy in two, east and west. So now that he's got control of the Mississippi, he is able to kind of come right down to the coast, split the South in two, and they can't communicate with one another across that river. So it's essential. So then, fast forward a year, you get what's called Sherman's March, which is William Tecumseh Sherman, who was a very fierce, a kind of uncompromising guy who during that phony war I was telling you about, he had said he needed 200,000 men in the middle of 1861, and everybody thought he was completely mad, and they dismissed him. They actually fired him, and then he was despondent for the next kind of year and was drinking and was depressed because. They just thought he was nuts. How on earth he won't need these men? Of course he was actually. It turned out he was actually underestimating the amount of men he needed. They realised this. They brought him back on board, and then he becomes a real jewel in the crown for the North, along with Grant. And he marches on Atlanta, Georgia, which is a massive centre for arms production. So. And it's a rail hub as well, so it's essential for rail travel all across the South. So it totally takes out their sort of
logistical capacity.
Richmond is the capital, but Atlanta is the kind of HQ in terms of logistics. So that is a massive success, and it also helps Lincoln to win, to be re-elected in 1864. He's actually running against McLellan, who the useless one who wouldn't use his army, who eventually is removed from his post by Lincoln because he won't use his army. So he is incredibly bitter about that, runs against Lincoln deliberately. He's very popular with his own men because they quite liked not ever having to actually do any fighting.
Yeah, not actually having to do anything.
Yeah, and they felt very proud of themselves because they were like the best trained unit and they never really had to do anything. So they loved him. So he kind of got a bit drunk. He got high on his own supply a bit and thought he could win. But of course, in the broader sphere, he was absolutely decimated by Lincoln. And I think after that, he's so wounded by that he moves to Britain, I think, or something. He actually leaves the country. Goes to
the old country instead.
Yeah, he's so stung. He's so kind of stung by that. Anyway, so it's a massive coup for Lincoln. It's right. It's a bit like his Falklands, basically. It's like he was ailing a bit. It was the war was becoming incredibly unpopular. In 1863, he introduced conscription, and you have the Draft Riots in New York in 1863 because a lot of the New Yorkers are saying, "Why am I going to fight? Why am I going to fight to free the blacks when I'm sort of suffering immense poverty myself? Why on earth would I fight on behalf?" And there's a lot of racism in the North. I mean, the North is not a sort of paradise.
Well, yeah, let's not pretend it's like a beacon of
kind
morality.
of social relation. Yeah, it's not a sort of paradise of social relations. Yeah. There is plenty of racism. So I don't know if you've seen the film Gangs of New York, the Scorsese film, but it's all based around the New York draft riots. It's the sort of centre of the film. So that's massively unpopular in the North because they sort of think, not only why would I fight for the blacks when my lot is so terrible in life, but I'm also looking at wealthy sons of influential people who can buy their way out because if you got somebody to go instead of you could avoid the draft.
Get out of it.
So that was also time. Yeah, so that also rankled as well. So that's why then the draft riots erupt, and they're really vicious. And actually, I think there's a black orphanage in New York that is burnt down with all of the orphans inside. It's pretty grim. Pretty horrifying stuff. I think that's left out of. I think Scorsese wisely leaves that out of the film because it would rather undermine the main characters who are part of this riot.
But I think it's those kind of stories that are often left out because it's not convenient to kind of the grandeur of the victory that's to come.
Quite.
But it's
it's a bit like that orphanage that you were telling me about that the RAF accidentally bombed in Denmark. It's sort of you sort of think, oh, that's not part of that. We don't want that to be part of the story.
Wait, that doesn't make us look good. Like we should probably not leave that part in.
Yeah, maybe not. Yeah. Anyway, so basically, once Atlanta is captured, it's game over for the Confederacy. Because what little supplies they had are now totally
gone. It was also just logistically, they're not able to supply themselves.
Yeah. And as I had said in a previous episode, the Home Guard in the South, the sort of influential families in each town who didn't have to fight because it was their job to sort of enforce law and order. They were just kind of asset stripping the local farms and just taking everything. So not leaving people enough and sending it to the troops desperately because the troops were literally starving. I mean, it was brutal. So of course they're just stripping the land of everything, and so the poor families on the land can't grow anything because everything has been taken from them. So they have nothing left to give, and so food production kind of grinds to a halt because they've done this sort of mad rush and just taken everything, and then nothing.
It's sort of kneecapped their own agricultural industry.
Yeah. So you have the whole genre of Southern Gothic, which is a literary as well as a sort of film genre. So films like Cape Fear, Key Largo, films that focus on kind of madness. There's always a storm. There's always a storm in the background, kind of pathetic fallacy sort of stuff. There's incest. There's violence. There's all things that kind of characterize this genre of Southern Gothic. It all stems from this brutal defeat of the South in the Civil War and the utter devastation that the South experienced, and also not only literal devastation, but kind of the sort of mental. A bit like the Germans after the First World War, they just couldn't believe that they'd lost. They thought,
shell shock. It's shell shock. It's collective shell shock almost.
They just go, how on earth did this happen? We thought we could.
We thought we were the big dog. We should have been winning.
Yeah, and not only that, but it's insult to injury because what are called carpetbaggers, the Northerners who come down to basically take advantage of the fact that the South has been destroyed, and they just scoop up what's left and make a pretty penny out of it all, and they are totally loathed, Yankee carpetbaggers, as they're derisively called, because the Confederate dollar itself was worthless. It sort of experienced hyperinflation. So a member of my own family, I think it's my great grandmother on my grandmother's side, she was tricked because she owned everything she could see land-wise. She owned everything she could see to the horizon in this beautiful part of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. And I think her husband had died fighting, and she was left with this. And she was unaware, like a lot of people were, of the true state of the Confederate dollar, that she didn't understand the economics of it. She thought, well, a dollar's a dollar, surely. So, of course, all these damned Yankee carpetbaggers come down, and they give her what seems to her like a lot of money in Confederate dollars for the land and buy it off her. And of course, they've totally robbed her blind. It's worthless. Within a few months, the currency you can't even use the currency. It's been once the South is readmitted, it's just scotched as a currency entirely. But even by that point, by the time they buy it off her, it's totally hyperinflated to the point where it felt like a fair deal to her, but she got totally swindled.
Yeah.
So Southern Gothic is an interesting psychological thing that springs out of this utter devastation that the South experiences, which culminates in, as I mentioned before, this surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee turns up and both he and Grant are incredibly courteous to one another. And there's all these moving details, like Grant is kind of trying to do small talk at first because he doesn't want to get to the point. And Lee says, come on, we both know why we're here. Let's get on with this,
Yeah.
And the scribe, had to give his pen to somebody else because he was shaking too much, recording the whole thing. Beautiful sort of details. And the northern soldiers start to cheer when Lee comes out, and it's clear that the surrender has been made, officially made. And Grant rebukes them and tells them, no, we're not cheering at this. This is a sad day, and it's a very somber. It should be a sort of joyful moment, but of course, in an international war, it is a joyful moment like VE Day because you have vanquished your foe, and your foe is this completely separate entity to you. But this is sort of Cain and Abel. This is brother on brother.
Well, it's fratricide. It is.
Yeah, it is, and it's a very sad moment. So Grant himself, there's no sense of kind of, I mean, aside from the few who kind of don't read the room and and cheer and are told off by Grant. It's a very melancholic moment. And it's a sort of Pyrrhic victory. It's like, okay, we've preserved the Union, but at what cost? This is going to be hard. This is going to be really tough. And after the war, to sort of jump slightly, because of course we had the assassination of Lincoln in April of '65. Shortly after, I believe it was April, it might be May. Shortly after the surrender, an actor called John Wilkes Booth, who's again a Southern fire eater, he catches wind that Lincoln is going to be attending Ford's Theatre to see this light comedy called My American Cousin, sort of Oscar Wilde-y sort of comedy. So he thinks brilliant, and Grant is going to go, and several other generals. So he and his kind of ragtag bunch of misfits all say, they parcel out all the jobs, and they say, right, okay, Booth says, well, I'm going to get Lincoln. You get Grant, you get Sherman, you get, all these. I don't think Sherman was there, but you know what I mean. All the they were sort of delegating all the assassinations, but he was the only one who actually went through with his. Grant, luckily for Grant, he didn't. He cried off sick or something before, so he didn't actually go. He wasn't actually there. So Wilkes Booth sneaks into the presidential box, shoots him in the back of the head. He actually, interestingly, he enters with a knife in one hand and a gun in the other. So I guess he thought, if it all goes wrong, I can
do it the old-fashioned way.
I can stab the guy. Yeah. So shoots him in the back of the head, jumps over the balcony, gets his foot caught in the kind of curtain stuff, the kind of frilly stuff that's on the edge of the balcony, sort of lands awkwardly, breaks his foot, and as he lands on stage, and he cries out, "Sic semper tyrannis." So thus is it always to tyrants or something. And sort of limps off stage. But apparently some people in the theatre hear it as the South is avenged. So it's ambiguous as to exactly what he said, but the general consensus is that he says something along the lines of "Sic semper tyrannis." But because Lincoln is assassinated, he's replaced, just as JFK is, he's replaced by a Johnson, Andrew Johnson, his vice president. But Andrew Johnson, because in the election of '64, you've always got to think, when you're picking a vice president, it's the same today. When you're picking a vice president, you want somebody who is going to bring in people that you're not necessarily bringing in. So Johnson is a Southern sympathizer. He's a Southern man. He's a Tennessee man. So he is kind of he's on the ballot precisely to bring together as many different factions as can possibly be brought together for Lincoln's victory. Because Johnson is more of a Southern sympathizer, he basically just lets them off scot-free, lets the South off scot-free, readmits them with very little fuss, is very, very lenient, and basically undoes, in all but name, kind of undoes the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's a massive setback for the newly freed blacks, because suddenly their former owners their former masters are now basically back as they were before. They still own the land that they owned before, yes, they're now free, but a lot of them end up actually working for their old masters, but now getting paid a sort of pittance. So things don't really change all that much. There is following that a period of quite healthy Reconstruction, which is incredibly productive for Black Americans. But initially, it's really, really tough. And then, of course, you get a short period of Reconstruction followed by Jim Crow. You also get in 1867 the founding of the Ku Klux Klan. So basically, the South is pissed off and looking to get back whatever they can, and they've got an awful lot of sympathizers in the North who let them do it. And it's a bit of a hollow victory for the abolitionists, because and this is where you get the Great Migration as well up to the northern cities, because although they're free, they ostensibly get their 40 acres and a mule. Something that Kendrick Lamar puts in several of his songs, I've noticed. Although they get their federally instituted 40 acres and a mule, life is by no means improved. It's a tough existence.
Yeah.
That's kind of the whole picture in a sort of nutshell, if you like. Are there anything I've kind of left there's probably lots I've left unsaid, but anything from that you're still wondering, well, how does that work?
No, I mean, to be fair, I think that's a good overview, because obviously myself, along with all of the listeners as well, with topics like this, you can think of it as quite simplistic, and you can think of it as like you have a winner and a loser, and then that's kind of the end of it. But the thing is, with a lot of these with civil wars, the actual conflict itself is a minute percentage of all of the kind of stuff that happens over time. So you have the build-up, which is obviously caused by a certain tension, which is caused by belief systems, kind of the economic situation in both sides, and then you have the conflict, and then you have the fallout of that conflict. You have obviously you had the North, which officially won the war, but at the same time have a Southern sympathizer president that comes into power after the main guy gets assassinated, and all of a sudden he's basically rolling back everything that they gained from winning that war. So and I think as well,
he is, in fact, because he's such a bastard, he's impeached. He's one of the first. I think hang on, who am I thinking of? Andrew Jackson is the first president to be impeached back in the 1830s, but Andrew Johnson is, I believe, the second.
Yeah.
So he's only president for a very, very short time, but unfortunately he does a lot of damage. I think he's only president within the year of 1865. I don't think he even makes it into 1866 because he's impeached so quickly. But and U.S. Grant, the great general who I was telling you about, who finally defeated Lee, he is then president, either next or one after. I can't quite remember exactly when. And he does a lot of good work, and the Reconstruction under his administration is going really, really well. But he is also felled by corruption within his administration. Finds himself out of a job. Loses the following election. Finds himself out of a job, and then discovers he had been a terrible businessman before. He was kind of they say he was a failure in all things except for war. He was always plagued by alcoholism, and he was an alcoholic, but it's exaggerated by the press to a certain extent. There's a beautiful biography by Ron Chernow, which I'm reading at the moment, of Grant, about halfway through. And the poor guy is, he has his moments where he turns to the bottle, but of course, whenever he's not, and somebody's got it in for him, they start putting it about that he's back on the bottle again. Yeah. And there is one particularly stonking victory that he achieves. And of course, whiskey is his poison. And so it comes back to Lincoln that Grant has won. And he says something like, find out for me what brand of whiskey he's drinking, and I'll order a case of it for all of my generals. Because he sort of accepts that Grant is a flawed individual, but he needs him. McLellan's clean as a whistle, but he's useless. So he's a bit of a flawed genius, is Grant. But anyway, he goes back into business again. He is basically taken. He invests some money and is swindled out of the money that he invests because he doesn't really know what he's doing. Finds himself completely penniless, and then discovers he's got throat cancer. So he thinks, shit, my family are going to be left with nothing here. So Mark Twain, a friend of his, says to him, okay, write your memoirs and I'll get them published. So amazingly, there's pictures of him, and he is on death's door, is Grant. He's got a kind of cloth over sort of wet cloth over his head, and he's kind of hunched over, and he's writing in his notepad. And it's a bestseller. It's a total bestseller when it comes out. And he finishes it, and then a week later he dies. And the funds, the proceeds that it raises, help to look after his family, his kids, who otherwise would have been destitute. Yeah. So quite moving. A little bit like Stanley Kubrick finishes his final masterpiece, Eyes Wide Shut. He finishes editing it, and I think it's 2 weeks later, dies because he'd been ill. So it's the sense that there's this work that has to be done, and it keeps you alive while you're doing it. But so a slightly sad, but hopeful in a sense end to U.S. Grant's life, because his memoirs are now a sort of standard go-to. They're published by Penguin Classics, and they're very well regarded. And I haven't read them. I've got them somewhere, but I haven't read them yet. But to all intents and purposes, apparently very well written. Not kind of rushed off junk. In a desperate kind of commercial attempt to make some money. They're thoughtful and well written, and apparently very good. Yeah. So I'd like to try those at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. But super interesting. And I think there's obviously so many more topics that we can cover within the Civil War as well.
Oh yeah.
Certain battles.
Well, the role of Native Americans, too, is really interesting, because they take both sides. That it's not a sort of, they're not involved, and they're not involved only on one side. They are, depending on the tribe, split north and south. So there's some fascinating stories there, which I'd like to get into, but obviously not today. Today is a general overview.
Well, also is like people also seem to sometimes mischaracterize the sort of like Native Americans as kind of one group, whereas there are so many different tribes across the state, like across the country and the continent, different. That had their own kind of interests and, and stuff.
Yeah. Some of them were completely anti the US and didn't want anything to do with them. Some of them, like the Cherokee, which is the tribe local to where I'm from, were much more cooperative with the US government, and were able to win certain, not entirely, because there's the Trail of Tears, which we won't get into now, but where they're sort of sent west, and a lot of them die along the way, and it's very brutal. But some of them are granted sort of protected areas in the east, and aren't forced west because they cooperate to a certain extent. So there's different tribes have completely different ways of relating to the US government, and the extent to which they sort of take on European custom and language and clothing and all the rest of it. And there's others who don't. And there's some that are very brutal, and some that are more compassionate to the people they come across. And it's a total, they're by no means one homogenous block. I think I've got a book, and I think it's called 300 Nations. The idea being that there are 300 tribes, Native American tribes. So enormous amount of variation within that.
Yeah, of course. But yeah, I guess to round it off, what would you, if you could pick out one specific aspect of the Civil War, whether that's a person, a battle, a certain kind of thing that happened that you want to cover in the future, what would it be?
Well, certainly the Native American story, because that's very interesting. It might be interesting to look at the music of the Civil War. I don't know how we do that exactly, but there is some fascinating stuff musically and the literary side as well. It's one of the most literary. I think some people call it the most literary war in history, because the diaries are just absolutely extraordinary. From soldiers on both sides, right down to there's in the documentary they focus on two characters who are regular soldiers, Elisha Hunt Rhodes from the north and Sam Watkins from the south, and they are writing these extraordinarily beautiful, poignant letters. So the literary side and the musical side are fascinating, as well as the actual military history. But certainly, I think if I had to pick one thing, the Native American story, I think, because it's something that I think even a lot of Americans don't know about. Obviously, we don't know about really any of it over here, but over there, I think the Native American story gets lost amongst because we're focusing on African Americans as being the kind of central people around whom the whole issue of slavery has blown this country up. So we forget that actually there's a whole other group of people
who were there first.
Well, quite, yeah, and many of them were slave owners themselves, Native Americans. So lots of interesting stories there. But yeah, we should probably wrap up.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's been very interesting. I've really enjoyed learning about. I mean, obviously, like it's always good when you haven't got that much of an idea about a certain topic, and then you come out of it having a much better understanding of kind of the way that things play out.
Good. I hope it was somewhat coherent.
I think we're doing all right at this podcasting business. Yeah, I think we're doing all right.
I think we're pretty good. We're pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. But so that'll do it for that episode. Well, for this episode rather. And thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.
Take care. From a guy called Alan Pinkerton, who is the head of his Secret Service, and he busts wide open a plot to assassinate Lincoln on the way. When the troops come marching through, they are basically told, leg it, get as quickly as you can along this street called Pratt Street. And as they progress through, there's a sort of hailstorm of projectiles being thrown at them by disgruntled locals.
Shooting civilians in a riot in a place you're already unpopular is definitely going to go well for you.
Lincoln even goes so far as to withdraw the right of habeas corpus, which is very, very controversial, obviously.
You could even look into like an alternate history scenario where, Maryland does secede from the Union, and how does that impact the whole overall conflict, and how does that impact the politics of it?
The madams of the Secesh brothels would actually charge double or even triple the rates to Union soldiers if they stayed. A lot of prostitutes actually ended up as unintentional spies.